This episode of AURAM'S Forum is sponsored by Batman Master of Fear. It's an upcoming web series that pits Batman versus the evolution of fear, a creature by the name of Nightmare. Not only does the show create a new threat for the Caped Crusader, but for the first time, Batman will showcase the martial art prowess he truly has. With hard-hitting fight scenes and intense choreography, Master of Fear will be a show any comic book fan will need to check out. Alright everybody, welcome back to AURAM'S Forum, and today is the day. This is the Bendis episode. This is the episode that I'm going to dedicate to Bendis to hopefully lay the topic to rest. I talked a lot about Bendis in the first 3 episodes of this show. Didn't really touch on him last episode, which is good. Just kind of yelled about John Romita Jr. a lot. But in this one, we're going to talk about Brian Michael Bendis, comic book writer extraordinaire. He is a very polarizing boy. He is very much acclaimed in certain respects and very much hated in many others. So I think we're gonna break this video down into a couple sections, starting with certain nitpicks of how he writes dialogue, certain things he does great with dialogue, where he works best, when he doesn't work, like, really at all, and just some of the highlights of his career. So starting off with dialogue, dialogue is the most controversial thing that Bendis is known for. He writes dialogue in a very interesting way that most people would describe as realistic, but the problem that people have with it is that he goes too far with the word realistic sometimes. And this is because he just writes very long-winded, like, speeches between characters, and some people just don't like that at all. I personally think it works really well at its best. At its worst, it's pretty embarrassing and irritating. And the main thing that people don't like about Bendis' writing with the dialogue is when he does, like, this back and forth between 2 characters, where, for example, we'll say Spider-Man and Captain America are talking, and Captain America is like, "Hello, it's me, Captain America from S.H.I.E.L.D." And Spider-Man will be like, "S.H.I.E.L.D.?" And Captain America will say, "Yes, S.H.I.E.L.D., Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement and Logistics Division." And then Spider-Man would say, "Oh, S.H.I.E.L.D." And then Captain America would say, "Yes, S.H.I.E.L.D." And then they would continue their conversation. It's just stuff like that where it's a back and forth where 2 characters are having a specific dialogue about something, and because of, like, this realism that Bendis likes to write, they just go back and forth on that same topic for way too long, and the middleman of just implication and us as a reader knowing what's happening is just thrown out the window. And Bendis is like, yeah, it's fine. Again, I personally think that this is fine. At its worst, it's kind of terrible. There was a recent issue of Invincible Iron Man with Riri Williams that it was kind of a little bit frustrating with. She was having, like, a conversation with a civilian and was like, "Do this thing," and he was like, "This thing?" And she was like, "Yeah, this thing." He was like, "Okay, this thing." She was like, "Yeah, this thing." And it's a little bit just clunky the way he writes dialogue sometimes, but most of the time it's very natural and very good. And this kind of leads me into another criticism that a lot of people have for Bendis is he doesn't really work super well in a setting of issue-by-issue comic stuff. And I touched on this pretty heavily in the series being... It was either episode 1 or episode 2. I don't know. I'm talking about Bendis a lot in this show. I touched on it briefly there, where I think Bendis would work better under a Netflix model of comics. That is to say that he writes his entire story, puts it in one book, an original graphic novel or something. Like, the most recent one that Marvel's put out is, I think, Avengers Rage of Ultron, which was years ago, but I think that's the most recent one that they put out. And then he just releases it. Like, Netflix releases a whole season, he would release his whole story arc at once. And that way, it avoids the last page cliffhangers that people are so irritated with. So yeah, the style that Bendis writes in is just kind of unsatisfying to people. People feel like they're being cheated with their purchase. It's mostly because he will be writing his story and then he'll get to a point where it just kind of fizzles out and nothing really happens. Something on the last page might happen, but 9 times out of 10, you just get to the last page and you feel like you reject. You're like, where's the rest of this comic? I feel like it should have gone on for 20 more pages, but it doesn't. So yeah, Bendis is a big fan of this type of storytelling, which is called decompression storytelling. It's where basically something big will happen in your comic or your story, and then it just takes a long time to level your characters out and get them back to the place that they were before, or just back to a similar place. And some people see this as a bad thing. It can work really well, like in Ultimate Spider-Man, a book where he was able to write the character for 15 years. It worked pretty well. It came out very slowly, and I'm sure that at the time, people reading it month to month were just agonized by it. But as someone who was reading it in trade and omnibus format and just like binged it basically, I thought it was fantastic. And I think that's why Bendis would work better under a Netflix model of him writing his story arc, sending it out fully complete, just like Netflix films and edits and just produces an entire season and then putting it up on Netflix just for you to watch immediately. So yeah, that's basically all that I have to say about Bendis's writing style. People either like or dislike his realistic dialogue, and people either like or dislike his decompression storytelling. But I think we should move on to the next point, which I want to talk about, which is continuity errors, which Bendis is, especially lately, is known for just being very bad about. Continuity is something that is highly regarded in superhero comic books today, especially over at Marvel and DC. It's this idea that a shared universe needs to pay attention to everyone's stories just to make sure that there are no continuity errors. So like, if Spider-Man is in one suit in this book, he needs to be in that same suit in this other book, at least if they take place at the same time. And Bendis seems to ignore continuity a lot. It was fine when he was writing in the Ultimate Universe because he was just in that playground for so long where he was just creating things, and anything that seemed like it might be a continuity error was probably just Bendis creating something, and it didn't really harp too much. Of course, there were continuity errors there, but they were much less so. Now that he's in the mainstream Marvel universe, he has his hands on big name characters like Iron Man and just characters that have been around in this universe for forever. I talked about this a lot in the inspiration for this show, which was an episode of the show with the views where I basically gave like a comic book eulogy for Civil War II issue 5, which is a Bendis book, where he just had a lot of huge continuity errors, like Doctor Strange casting a teleportation spell over like 30 people, where at the time magic is pretty much dead, so he shouldn't have been able to cast that large of a spell. And Luke Cage in his own book saying that he didn't want to be a part of this Civil War because the last Civil War is so messy, but in Bendis's big fight issue, Luke Cage is still around there just fighting up a storm, not caring about what he said in his own issue. It's just little things like that that really frustrate people, and honestly really frustrate me. And I think this is why also Bendis could work very well in his own continuity, because again, you could just have like the Bendis universe where he just writes story arcs like a Netflix model, and they're just in their own continuity, so that he could just do whatever he wants, and we can get the good things about Bendis without the bad things about Bendis. And I think a lot of writers would like to do something like that as well. It would give them a lot of creative control over what they're doing, and also would allow them to take their time and tell their full story and be able to do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do in an issue-by-issue story. Going back a little bit, another big continuity error that people were recently very upset about was during Secret Wars and Bendis' Old Man Logan run. In the first issue, Old Man Logan talks about the Thors, and it's shown that he's very aware of Battleworld and the Thors police system. Not hyper aware of like Dr. Doom and his court, he just knows that the Thors are the police for this world that he's on. But in issue 2, there's a moment where Logan sees a Thor, and he says to her, "Why are you wearing the clothes of a dead man?" And people were very upset about this, mainly because they took it as Bendis saying that he just pretty much forgot what he wrote in the last one, or he's already retconning it or something. And people were just upset. I personally didn't take it the way that most people did. While reading the comic genuinely, I thought that he was saying, and this could be the intent, I don't know if Bendis ever commented on it, I thought that Logan wasn't saying he's just never seen this ethereal Thor being before. I thought he was saying, why are you wearing the clothes of my dead friend? My friend Thor, who died in the wastelands, and now you're disrespecting him by wearing his clothes. That's how it came across to me. It didn't come across as him never seeing the Thors before. He was just being Logan, being like, come on, man, that's not nice, don't do that. Okay, so those are the two, like, controversial, polarizing things that Bendis is known for, his dialogue and his continuity errors. So now I kind of just want to move into some of the highlights of his career, things that Bendis has done really well, and examine why they did really well. The biggest one here is Ultimate Spider-Man. Bendis wrote it for nearly 15 years, and it is the start of the Ultimate Universe. He was able to play in his own little playground for as long as he wanted and pretty much do whatever he wanted with the Spider-Man character. Sure, the editors and Marvel had creative control, but he's just able to pretty much do what he wanted. It was a dream for Bendis. And honestly, I think this is where he thrived, because Bendis, as a writer, is plagued by the dialogue and the continuity errors and stuff, and dialogue was pretty good in Ultimate Spider-Man. There were some, like, few weird mix-ups in it, but continuity really was a non-issue. He was in his own universe, like I said he should be, and he was able to just write whatever he wanted. Another really good book that people really seem to point to as a good Bendis book is his Daredevil Run. I haven't personally read it, but people say it's a very good analysis of Matt Murdock, and they basically say that he gave Matt Murdock the Ultimate Spider-Man treatment, which is interesting because the Daredevil Run, as far as I know, is set in the mainstream Marvel Universe, not in the Ultimate Universe. And my honorable mention here, which I talked about in the time travel episode, is All New X-Men. I really like it. A lot of people don't. I think it was just because there was this movement to hate Bendis when Marvel Now came out a couple years ago. So anything that Bendis' name was on was just utter trash garbage no matter what, which is confusing. That's just ignorant and not logical. But I really enjoyed All New X-Men. There were parts of it that were a little weird and campy, and maybe just not very well written, but overall, I enjoyed it. On the flip side of that is his Guardians of the Galaxy run, which was being written alongside the All New X-Men book at the time, and it's just not great. It's kind of plagued by a lot of huge continuity, just weirdness, because, like Peter Quill, and I'm going to do a video about this eventually, Peter Quill before this book was a very different character in costume and personality and everything, and he just kind of messed with them all. And even, like, disregarding that stuff, because when I read the first couple volumes of his Guardians of the Galaxy without reading any of, and I still haven't read any of the original, like, that team, Guardians of the Galaxy stuff from, like, Cosmic 2008-ish era, and I thought it was just bad in general. Like, the storytelling in it was just weird and not great. So there you have it, folks. The Bendis episode. I hope I got my point across on I really didn't have a point. I just kind of wanted to talk about Bendis and get it out of my system. I think he's really good at his best, but just god-awful at his worst. It's just, like, infuriatingly so. Like, he's not even a bad writer most of the time. It's just, like, he just has such a disrespect for other people's work sometimes with the continuity errors. But, like, I'm fine with when he's just writing poorly. Like, Guardians of the Galaxy did have some, like, continuity disrespect for previous work, but it was also just kind of written poorly, and that's fine. Like, All New X-Men I really like because, in my eyes, from what I see, there weren't a lot of continuity errors. I mean, it's time travel, so of course there were, but not any, like, blatant, like, glaring, disgusting ones. But there were some times where the writing was just poor, and that doesn't make me angry. It's just bad. There's nothing I can do about it. When people are just being rude and not respecting other people's work, that's not okay. You shouldn't do that. We have editors in Marvel Comics and just comics in general for a reason. Keep this guy in check. Don't let Bendis run wild because he's Bendis. Kind of touching on the same thing I did in the John Romita Jr. episode. Just because he's John Romita Jr. Sr.'s son doesn't mean he should get all these books. Just because he's Brian Michael Bendis, movie star writer, doesn't mean he should have all these books. And again, currently I'm fine with the state of Bendis writing. The books that he's writing right now, Infamous Iron Man, Invincible Iron Man, Jessica Jones, Spider-Man, are all great, in my opinion. I think they're pretty phenomenal, but that's not to say that he's written some pretty shitty stuff in the past. So anyway, thanks for watching. I'm going to stop myself before I keep ranting about Bendis. Again, I don't want to leave you with me thinking that Bendis is terrible. I hope this came across as pretty neutral and just as an analysis of Bendis as a writer. If you want to continue the conversation in any way, head on over to the Twitters. Thanks again to Andrew for editing this. Here's his Twitter. Go follow him. Tell him he's great. He does this for pretty much free, and I very much appreciate it. This show would not be able to consistently come out every week if it wasn't for him. So, thanks, Andrew. Anyway, I'm gonna go not yell about Bendis anymore. Bye-bye.